I want to introduce everyone to the afternoon session of Drisha's Summer Kollel. On this slot at Tuesdays, we have the pleasure of learning with Rabbi David Silber and Rabbi Jon Kelsen. They'll be switching off each week for teaching us about Together the Tribes of Israel. This week and next week we have Rabbi Kelsen, and for the final class we have Rabbi David Silber. Rabbi Jon Kelsen is the Dean of Drisha. Sources for this class will be posted in chat. And with that, I want to hand things over.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so let me just say a few words of introduction. This is helpful for me to know what you guys are thinking about and where you're at. Okay, so this is a three-part series on the book of Numbers, core themes in Sefer Bamidbar, the book of Numbers. The reason we chose to talk about the book of Numbers is there's two reasons. One is that those of you who are in the call in the morning are learning the second parak of Makot, the second chapter of Masechet Makot, and that the halachot, as you know, but at this point, some of the halachot about your miklat, they first appear in earnest, right, or at least in elaboration in Sefer Bamidbar, and you can sort of pull it out of that context. But we thought it'd be important to also try to understand it in that context of that book. Is to say, what is the sort of resonance or the meaning of Ir Miklat and all of those laws about the city of refuge and accidental manslaughter. Like, how does that play into the broader story and the narrative arc of the book of Numbers? That was one reason we talk about this. And the second is sort of calendrical, which is that, right now we're reading the book of Numbers, Kriyat Torah, if you do the annual cycle. So we are in Parshat Shalach, right, the story of the spies, kind of right in the middle of the thick of things, and so the sort of the serendipity of those two forces led to the choice of this series. I want to say that with regards to maybe this sort of something that Willow said prompts me to say this is that this is again like a three-part, like basically 3 hours, give or take, and sort of an overview of some of the core themes of the book of Numbers that can't cover everything, obviously. That would be like a multi-year study, but also can't replace encountering the text for your on your own directly and in full. I once took a course on the book of Deuteronomy of Devarim, and the professor said, okay, first class introduction, for next class, read the book, right? And he may read the book in whatever language, English or Hebrew or whatever you want, but there's actually something to be said for reading the entirety of the book, not in an overwhelming way. It's not that long a book, right? But to gain a sense of actually, its flow, what it actually says, right, in its entirety from the beginning to end. Otherwise, you can't really appreciate it as a book if you haven't read the book. So this course is not meant. I'm going to try not to make too many assumptions about background knowledge of the book, maybe some, but on the other hand, you should look at this as the beginning of a conversation and the beginning of an exploration, not a summation, right, of study of the book of Numbers. We're going to try to lay out a way of thinking, or some ways, I should say, ways of thinking about the book, which might provide a helpful schema, or as they say in yeshivish language, a mahalach, like a way of a path for thinking through, thinking about, thinking with, reading, right, the book of and learning from the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers. In just a few minutes, by the way, you may be noticing that I keep on saying the book of Bamidbar and then the book of Numbers, but depending on if your Hebrew is up to it, you'll notice that those are not translations, one or the other. Bamidbar means in the desert, and Numbers means numbers, and there's a reason. Those are distinct names, and we're gonna come to that. Try to get into that in just a moment. But let me, here I'm gonna not assume tremendous background knowledge, but like whatever you do know, right, of the book, even if you now only sort of know that it has two names at least, the book of Numbers and Bamidbar, in the desert. But whatever you know about the book, if someone asked you in an elevator for the elevator pitch for the book, what is this book about? Like, what's it about? What might you say? I'm going to ask you to think about that for a few seconds, and then just to do it, simultaneously, to write in whatever you want into the chat. It doesn't have to be full-blown thesis. Do not be shy or embarrassed about if you don't have a thesis, because most people don't have a thesis about it. Among other things, it's a rather unwieldy book. That's part of the challenge of the book numbers, that it's hard to follow structurally. But given that caveat, what's this book about? Okay, so let me just sort of react to what you wrote, and I would love this, by the way, to be interactive. So that means two things. One is, unless you have like ambient noise around you, feel free to unmute us, which is a small enough group that we can actually talk. So feel free to unmute and just be talking, and also be interacting with each other. And so let me put it this way: did anyone notice something that someone else wrote that they want to comment on, ask for clarification, or somehow react to? Something surprising, something that you hadn't thought about, that you don't understand? Go ahead, Lola. Yeah.
I usually think of Bamidbar as a lot about like laws and like kind of a long list of tribes, and it's kind of hard to understand. So sorry, that's my phone. I think the point that some people made about like leadership struggles and like the transitions going on and like the kind of more human aspect of the Sefer is really interesting.
Okay, great. Yeah. So in terms of like, first of all, yes, there's challenges of all sorts, leadership and otherwise. We'll definitely aim to talk about that. Yeah, in terms of let me work off of Sarah's, what she wrote, if that's okay, Sarah, as kind of a text. So you wrote in the second sentence, it's full of halachot, as well as stories about what happened during their time in the desert. So it's interesting, actually. The book of Bamidbar, of Numbers, certainly has multiple laws, multiple halachot that are given and recorded. Less so, I would say, than Leviticus on the one hand, Leviticus and Deuteronomy. It's more akin to Genesis and Exodus in that sense, but it does have halachot. What's something striking, and what it's on the source sheet, and I hope we get to it today, is Nachmanides, in his introduction to the book of Numbers. He says most of the halachot that are given in the book of Numbers, or he points out that most of the halachot in the book of Numbers are not what are called mitzvot l'dorot, are not commandments that are meant to be forever, right? According to the book itself, right? They're more halachot for the desert. There are exceptions. The truth is, I was thinking about that. Like, I didn't actually count it out, and there are plenty of halachot that are not just for the desert. But his point is intriguing anyway, which is to say that a bunch of the halachot read as like temporary halachot, right, or halachot for that time, and in that sense, they're kind of like, they are laws, but they're kind of like stories about laws, if you will, right? The whole thing is much more of a narrative and a story, and within the narrative of the book of Numbers, you have the narrative is conveyed at times through laws, if you will, right? Again, to the extent that, unlike, let's say, the book of Vayikra, where the halachot tend to be halachot l'dorot, right? These are halachot that are portrayed as being temporary. So I think that's an interesting point that the Rambam makes. You also wrote that Sefer is a book about when the Jews are in the desert after being freed from slavery, which is true. And what I think is really interesting about what you wrote, two different things, but one is that you could think about them when they're in the desert, they're between two places, right? They're between Egypt and the land. And you could think about it as being primarily about post leaving Egypt, as you sort of articulated it, right? Or one could have written, this is about the Jews in the desert, the Israelites in the desert before entering the land. Now, what we're going to try to claim, others have claimed this, is that it's actually both, right? And part of the tension, right, like the generative tension, what makes it a really good book, in part, is that the Israelites in this period are pulled in two directions at once. They're pulled towards the land, but they also seem to be still pulling Egypt with them, right? They even say at some point, right, why do we leave Egypt, right? Let's go back to Egypt, they actually say. Right? Let's go back to Egypt. So, and that's not just like a moment in the text, that's an indication that there's a part of them, this people, that actually is being pulled back to a prior story. And maybe I'll say at that moment that, what is the book that comes before the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers? I don't mean this to be like a pedantic question, but what is what's the prequel, if you will, for the book of Numbers?
Leviticus.
Okay, so the book before, if you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the books of the Pentateuch, is Vayikra, is Leviticus. So that's certainly true. That's certainly true on multiple levels. But it's also, you could also make the case, and we'll try to make this case. This, by the way, I learned this is not my own Kiddush, just I got from Rabbi Ben Nun. I heard something from a rabbi named Rabbi Ben Nun. I heard the name of someone named Rabbi Ben Nun this year, which really affected how I think about the book of Bamidbar. It's also the case that it is the book that comes after Exodus. It's actually one of the ways Exodus continues. Okay? There's two ways Exodus continues. He posits, and I'll explain what I'm saying more in just a moment. I know this is not clear. You have Exodus, and then it branches off into two sequels. One is called Leviticus. The other is called Numbers. And if you think about it that way, as Leviticus and Numbers kind of being two like alternate parallel universe sequels to the book of Exodus. Okay, if you think about it that way, then I think some really cool learning and possibilities emerge. Okay, so we'll come back to that. But this has to do with what Sarah wrote here about Bamidbar being a book about when the Jews are, right? It's after slavery. Okay, Lola writes it's about Moses and the children of Israel in the desert, right? So I think just stopping right there, I think that's really well said and really interesting. It's about Moses. It's about Moses, the person. What's Moses qua Moses, the person? It's about Moses, the leader, the Levite, and it's about the children of Israel in the desert. And there's something very true about that. In that, going back to what we just articulated, right? Leviticus and Numbers, right, is standing like in parallel to one another. So Leviticus isn't really about the people of Israel per se. What Leviticus is about, what Chazal call, what the rabbis call it, which is why it's called Leviticus, Torat Kohanim. Right? It's the Torah of the priest, basically, right? And then you have to explain much of the second half of the book, but certainly the first half of the book, right, is basically priestly laws. They say it's basically about the Kohanim, and it's basically about setting up the Mishkan. Essentially, the book of Bamidbar is much more about the people, and not only the people, in the sense of laws, but people in the sense of stories about the people, right? Their development, their challenges, right? So it's about the people of Israel. They are people of Israel, not just an audience for the book of Numbers, they are protagonists of the book of Numbers. Okay. I don't want to belabor the point too much, but everything people already are, right, is important. Let's see, Miranda writes about, right, the nominal part of the book is when the Israelites are being counted for a census. There's actually two censuses in the book. And note that it's called Numbers, right? And in the Hebrew, Sefer Pikudim, book of countings in the plural. Because there's two countings, there's two censuses in the book. One, and people familiar, one is in the very beginning of the book, right? Chapter 1 of the book already, right? It has the Tifkedu, right? You shall count them, Pikudim, you shall count them. And then in Parsha Pinchas, later in the book, there is a second census, a second counting. We'll see that in the commentary of Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, great 19th century commentator, in his Ha'amik Davar. So he tries to argue for he tries to explain why the rabbis would land on the censuses per se, right, as the thing after which to name the book. Right, all the things that happen in the book, why the censuses, right? Why pay attention to those? Okay, just on book 4 of the Torah, right? Waylaid for 40 years of doubt. So there you go, Justin. Right, they're on the verge of entry to the land, right? And that's definitely one way of reading the book. That it starts Bahar Sinai, and look how he says it. They're about to enter the land. So put that in conversation with Sarah's. It's after there, right? It's right after Exodus. It's right after slavery. And you see that tension from before, two different ways of thinking about it. Kayla, wrapping up the Dharma's experience getting to Sinai, from Sinai to Devarim, I think you probably meant. Yes, indeed. Okay, so we'll talk about the Sinai part of things. Tribal structures for sure. And then the wanderings, excellent, right? The wanderings and the idea of being in between, right? So this is part of what makes it such an interesting book, again, is that, narratives like tension and they also like movement and dynamism, and there's more movement and dynamism, I think, in the book of Numbers than there is in the book of Vayikra, which is why it's more of a narrative book. And it's indeed, it's in between the two, right? It's in between spaces, and that's part of where its beauty emerges from. Okay, great. I hope that was as helpful for me. I hope that was helpful for you. Given that, let's jump in and just remind you that it wouldn't be a bad idea. I know people have busy lives. It wouldn't be a bad idea between now and next week to read a chunk of this book, right? In whatever language you want to read it. You want to read it in. Not a bad idea. Okay, so given that, let's open. I'll open the source sheet, and I will screen share. But I want you to also maybe have it open on themselves. Let me see if I can find it here. Here we go. Okay. Okay, everyone sees that? Sees the source sheet on the screen? Is that coming across well? Great, perfect. Okay. Okay, so let me start this way. We spoke, I mentioned this point of Yoel Ben Nun, that there are two possible sequels to the book of Exodus. I want to sort of explain why can I not manipulate this? Excuse me. Let me see if I can get to this in a different place here. 1 second. Here we go. Okay, now I can. Okay, great. So explain what he meant by that. So at the end of book of Exodus, end of Shemot, these are the final verses at the end of Shemot, chapter 40 over here. And it says as follows. It says that the cloud covered the tent of meeting, covered the Ohel Moed, and God's kavod, the presence of God, God's glory, but the presence of God filled up the Mishkan. They built the Mishkan. They've recovered from the sin of the golden calf. They built the Mishkan, and now God is residing there, right? The place, that's why it's called Mishkan, a place for Shekhinah, a place for God to dwell amongst the people. And we find this thing that happened, which is verse 35, Moses can't get in. Moses can't enter because God is in there, right? God's cloud is filling it, and Moses therefore can't enter. That's one point. And then it goes on to say, and when the cloud would lift up from the tabernacle, then the Bnei Israel, the Israelites, would travel following it. Right? Yisu Bnei Israel b'chol masehem, they would travel, set out when the cloud lifts up. But if the cloud didn't move from the Mishkan, then they would from the Ohel Moed, then they would stay there. So they would only travel when the cloud was removed from that space, right? If that cloud means, it's kind of like saying they're like when God would sort of remove God's presence from that space, then they would travel until God dwelt in it again. They knew to camp. For God's Kenan Hashem al Mishkan Yomam ve'Eshia Labo le'nei b'chol masehem. For over the tabernacle, a cloud of Hashem rested by day, and a fire appeared by night. Right in the eye through the eyes of and the view of all the house of Israel throughout their journeys. This is the end of the book of Shemot. So there's two things at least to note about this. One is that interesting book of Shemot, they finally build this Mishkan, and how does the book end? Moshe can't enter. That's an interesting way to end the book, right? Moshe can't enter after all this elaborate building. The book decides to end by saying he can't enter because God's presence is there. That's one thing. And second of all, you have apparently two foci here. One, verse 34 to 35, which is Moses is being unable to enter because God is there. And then 36 to 38, which is about the traveling. That when the cloud is there, they rest, and when it moves, they move. Okay, two different points. And what Yoel Ben Nun noticed, which I think is very important, is that those two subsections of the final verses of the book of Exodus kind of are picked up. Those two threads, respectively, are picked up by the beginning of the book of Vayikra on the one hand, and the other in the book of our book here, right? The book of Numbers, the book of Devarim. So the beginning of Vayikra, we note that says the first verse, Vayikra el Moshe. This is the first verse of the book of Vayikra. Vayikra el Moshe, God calls, right? He called, right, to Moshe. God calls to Moshe. Vayedaber Hashem elav me'ohel moed lemor, and speaks to Hashem. Speak to him from the Ohel Moed lemor. So that Vayikra Moshe, what do you mean he called to him and then he spoke to him? That's a funny thing to say. What's this, and? But you realize that actually it's picking up from the end of verse 35, right? At the end of book of Exodus. The lo yachol Moshe lavo al moed ki shachan alav ha'anan u'chur Hashem alei hamashkan. But when God would call to Moshe and speak to him from the Ohel Moed, and then you see that's where the communication happens. And so it actually appears that the book of Vayikra picks up from that thread of verse 35, the end of the book of Shemot. And this is the story of the Ohel Moed as a place of Ohel Moed, a place of meeting, right? Meaning a place where the human and God can interact, which they haven't, and dwell together. They really haven't had that since the Garden of Eden, right? So now they finally have that built again, a place that they can be together, and a place which God, a place of revelation. It's a place where God can speak to the human. Okay, I mean, it is, as Ramban will note, as Nachmanides will note, it is as such the continuation of Sinai. Right? Sinai is also that place where the human is called, right? Called, in this case, that human is Moshe in both places, is called and spoken to. God reveals God's self and God's Torah to Moshe, the human, from that space. Okay, so this is one sense in which Vayikra follows the end of Shemot. But what the real, chidush here, right? The real, insight here is that the really, ultimate verses, the end verses 36, 38 of the book of Exodus, those really get picked up where? Not in Vayikra, but in the alternate sequel, which is Numbers. Because in the book of Numbers, which we note from the very first verses of Numbers, right, happened Bamidbar Sinai, Ohel Moed, right? That's where we left off at the end of Exodus, right? In the desert of Sinai, in this tabernacle we just built. What really happens, and here I'm skipping to chapter 9 of Numbers, where you really feel this. Look what it says. I'm not going to read the whole, it's a lengthy passage, right? But Ubiyom Hakim et Mishkan, the day the tabernacle was set up, the cloud covered the tabernacle, right? The Ohel et Mishkan, Ohel Edut, and it rested over it, like fire until morning. It looked like fire until the morning, but then there was a cloud during the day, and it was always there, right? The cloud covering it. It looks like fire at night. Verse 17, whenever the cloud lifts up in the tent, the Israelites set out accordingly. And when the cloud rests, that's where they rest. Verse 18, Api Hashem Yisu, Api Hashem Yachanu, right? They're traveling and resting all according to the word of God. God is, in other words, leading the camp, dwelling with them in the camp, And, I'm not going to read it inside. You have the source sheet. It goes on. The Torah makes a point of speaking quite verbosely over. It sort of repeats itself here at length, emphasizing the extent to which this was true, that they would travel only when God led them to travel. They would rest when God essentially indicated that they should rest, even if it was, a day or two or a month, whatever it was. This is how they did it. Api Hashem Yachanu, Api Hashem Yisau. They would camp and they would travel only according to God. I can't read the chats, by the way, while I'm screen sharing, so just feel free to speak up if you'd like. So this is really where you see, right, that point at the end of Exodus being picked up, right? The thread, the notion that they're going to be traveling, right, with and led by God, right, forward. Right? If you think about like our own lives, and think about the wanderings of the book of Numbers. So I'll speak for myself. I don't always know where I'm going, right? I don't only mean that in the sense of like, driving in Waze, but, in life at large, we don't always know where we're going. That's just like, part of the world that we live in. But the book of Numbers, at least until and inclusive of chapter 9, is talking about a different world. Right? This is a world where you leave Sinai, you build a tabernacle. That's the end of Exodus, end of Shemot. And then you're in a world which is, and I mentioned this, I think, yesterday morning for the Kollel, with the people who are there in the mornings. Then you enter a world in the book of Numbers, which is basically a continuation of this highly structured, highly contained, orchestrated, choreographed life, right? In which, you're all camped and like your set places around the center, which keeps you all connected, which is the Mishkan, the tabernacle. And you know exactly where you belong, and you know exactly where you're going and when you're not going, right? And that's maybe you don't know, but you do know that what's going to determine when you go and when you don't go, and that's the cloud and the fire. That's God in your mix. In other words, the world that's being described here. Again, I don't know about for you, but this is not the world that I live in. This is the opposite of the world that I live in, right? A world in which, right, no pun intended, right, or there's no cloudiness, right, of vision, right? It's entirely clear. You know exactly who you are, right? You've been counted. Everyone's been counted. Everyone. I mean, everyone meaning all the males from 20 and above. But as it were, everyone has been counted, even according to their skulls, meaning each individual is counted and situated within their family, within their clan, within their tribe. Okay? So we know who you are. We know where you belong. We know where you're camped. We know how you're situated in this world that's being described. And then you're camped around this portable Sinai, right? This place where God encounters the human. Again, we haven't had this since the beginning of Genesis, right? Since the book of since Eden, and we haven't had so much such structure, by the way, before the tabernacle since the first chapter of Genesis, right? Where everything is clear and divided, right? And we know where everything's according to its species. You see where I'm going? It's this perfect world being described, and that's where we pick up in the book of Numbers. But we'll see, however, that is true to a large degree, I think, for the first, let's say first third or half of the book of Numbers of Bamidbar. But then, how do they say? Then mere anarchy is loosed in the center that no longer holds, right? And you enter into an entirely different world, right? You enter into the world of Numbers. I'll just say at that point, the world of the desert. Excuse me. That there are these different names. Like I said, you have the book of Sefer Pikudim, as Chazal, as some places in Chazal they call it, the book of the countings, the censuses. And then I think that speaks to an extent, this world of counting, this world of clarity, right? Of structure. You can sort of quantify everything actually, and then orchestrate it. And then you have the book of Bamidbar, as it's also called, the book of Numbers, and that's the book of in the desert. And that evokes something very different, I think, for most of us, right? The world of the desert. This is the world of the wilderness. This is the world of I would say, vulnerability, the world of potential encounter with chaos, with enemies within, without, etc. It's a very different world. So even the two names, Pikudim and Numbers, right? The gesture directions. Let me pause for a second. Any, reactions to what we've been talking about so far? Questions, comments? This makes me think of this. I don't understand what you meant by that. I disagree. Anything?
I was just putting in the chat that it's like a holy GPS. That's like actually how I explain it to the little ones, because they've all been raised on iPads and they actually they understand that parallel.
Right. Exactly. Right. You think about the surety, just to date myself here, right? Before Waze and all of this, even GPS, right? When you had to, some of you must know what I'm talking about. When you had to print out MapQuest, so in hard copy, if you can imagine that. Okay, so that was that was like a different experience of setting out on the road, and then obviously MapQuest itself was an innovation. So yeah, totally. And by the way, is there anything in anything, if you know the book of Numbers, is there anything that happens in the beginning of that book which might like totally just challenge or disrupt this little idyllic picture I'm portraying of this perfect world? Okay, so you'll take a look at the opening chapters. I would note that it's not a world. The world that's described there, you'll see, it's not a world that doesn't know of tension, that doesn't know of rupture. it does know of the potential for rupture, and I'll give you some examples. Right, this is already in chapters, chapter 5 into chapter 6. I mean, chapter 5 and 6, you have people who are impure, right, emerging in the camp. It's told as halachot, right? Again, it's cast in legal narrative and legal language, excuse me. But I would argue it's more of a story that's adopting the language of law to express its point. So you have these people who are impure, right? Who are potentially going to, what does it say here? If you don't send them out, they pose a threat of impurity, right? Of vitiating and messing up the purity of this camp in which God is dwelling amongst them. So it knows of that possibility. Its solution, the Chumash's solution here, is to send them out. So it knows the potential rupture, if you will, but it tries to contain it, I would say. It tries to contain it by adopting a particular, I guess, technique or stratagem or whatever, which is to send them out, right, to preserve the purity of the camp. Or the next verse is in verse 5, in chapter 5 of the book of Numbers. This is not in your source sheet. I'm just reading inside the Chumash here myself, right? It talks about people who will sin and trespass against God. So it knows of that possibility, but it has a response to it, right? Or maybe quite dramatically, in the middle of chapter 5, the passage of the Sotah, right? Which might mean literally something like the wayward wife, right? The infidelity, at least in terms of the wife, in the marital union. So for the Chumash, right, that's a big potential rupture, a big potential problem. Actually, it's the same language there of uma'ala bo'ma'al, the same language of trespass that it used vis-a-vis, right, someone sinning against God earlier. Yeah, that's a whole fraught topic and tractate in its own right. But my point is simply that this section of the book here knows well, right, the possibilities again of rupture, of something breaking that structure, right? That's so like carefully delineated and set out here in the opening of the book, but it tries to contain it. What we'll see is later in the book is that things don't stay contained. Things don't stay contained. There's a major rupture, right? Actually emerges in the book. Okay. I would say this, by the way, even about the Nazir, but maybe we'll save that for another time. Okay, so that was sort of part one of the intro to the book of Numbers. Let's now encounter two introductions proper to the book of Numbers. One by Nachmanides and one by the Netziv and Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. I'm not going to read the whole thing. So again, you have them on your source sheets. But I want to just share parts of them with you. And then I want to, given the timing, I'm probably going to want to end with a note about the Haftorah for Parshat Bamidbar, and make a claim about how it functions as an interpretive key for not only the Parsha, but for the book as a whole. And then we'll pause and return together next week. Okay, that's our game plan for the next coming minutes. So Nachmanides has these great introductions to all the books of the Chumash. That was one of the main pieces of his, or I think one of the main teachings that he conveyed through his commentary on the Chumash, is that he took seriously the notion that the Chumash, the Pentateuch, is made up of 5 separate books. I mean, they cohere into one grand story, but each of the 5 books is its own book, right, with its own literary integrity and its own theme and themes, right? Maybe that sounds obvious, but as far as I can tell, other than some snippets of indications in the rabbis and the very fact that they are called the Chumash, they're called separate books, right? So it's someone thought of them as separate books, but as far as I can tell, he was the one who really, I'd say, amplified that notion, right? Really built on that notion that Genesis is Genesis. It's not only the first it's not only like the first chapters of the Pentateuch. It has its own integrity. It's its own thing. Exodus is its own thing, okay? And so too for all the books, including Numbers. So his introduction to Numbers He goes on to say as follows. I'm just going to read a little bit of it and spend more time on the Netziv, but I encourage you to read it in full on your own time. He says as follows. I'll read it in the Hebrew here. He says, Achar shebier Torata karbanot b'sefer hashlishi. After explaining the laws of the karbanot, the sacrifices in the third book, which is Vayikra, Leviticus, Hitchil ata l'sader is on page 3. Hitchil ata l'sader b'sefer hazeh hamitzvot shenishtavu be'inyan ol moed. Now the book of Bamidbar starts to talk about mitzvot that have to do with the tabernacle itself, right? Less the sacrifices and more the tabernacle itself. Ukvar is here al tumat mikdash v'kodosho l'dorot, and we've already been, given in Leviticus the halachot about, the prohibitions of rendering impurity, right, of impurifying, profaning the sanctity of the Mishkan. But in this book, yagbil Mishkan. In this book, what really happens is the boundaries are defined, right, about the tabernacle. Bamidbar, kasher yagbil har Sinai. And here's really the point that you kind of want to focus on, I think. I would say one wants to sort of underline is that he says, yeah, the Mishkan, if you note, is bounded and protected by its walls and by the priests and by the Levites, just like Sinai was bounded and protected, right, when the God's presence was there. And he starts to note all these parallels between what Sinai on the one hand and the boundaries around the Olam Moed on the other hand. Right, it says, for example, that anyone who's not a priest can't enter, right, into the tabernacle, into the to the holies, right, or the holy of holies, right, or right that non-priest can't enter. Just like it says there that anyone who comes close to Sinai, other than the people who are authorized, right, they're stoned, right, or they're to be stoned according to the book of Exodus, right? So they're protecting that space with Tziva, and he commands with regards to the Mishkan, v'lo yavo lerot kevalat hakodesh v'metu, that people can't just come in, right, and see what's happening in the sanctum of the Olam Moed, right? Just like we find by similar language, Pen Yarasu al Lerot el Hashem Lerot, by Sinai, that there was a warning against people sort of trampling and just rushing towards Sinai to encounter, to behold God. And even more importantly, B'tziva v'shmart mishmeret hakodesh, bet mishmeret mizbeach kasher marsham v'gam hakohanim hanigashim l'Hashem nikadashu v'chulei, right? The idea of protecting the Mishkan, this notion of mishmeret, right, protecting the holiness of the sanctuary, right? Just like we say there that the priests would protect the that the priests would protect the Sinai, or the priests can't go up into Sinai, etc. Right? So that what he's trying to describe, right, is this world in which you have a portable Sinai in your midst, right, which is how should I say this, is indicated, right, part of the indication, right, or an expression of this being Sinai and God is the protective layers that are placed around the Olam Moed, just like happened at Sinai, right? Which again, he notes actually it's in a way not only functional, like actually to keep people away from the sacred space, but also as an expression of the prestige of the place. Hakol ma'ala lamikdash ukavod lo. It's all an expression of the glory, the honor of the place. Eino domeh, this is what the rabbis say, it's like their analogy or metaphor. Eino domeh paltrin shel melech sheish lo shomrim lepaltrin she'en lo shomrim. Right? That a palace that has guards is different, is better, is more of a palace than the palace without guards, right? The honor guards, right? Because they indicate that this is a sacred space and elevate the sense of the sanctity of the space. So one major claim that he makes, the Ramban does, is that the Sinai experience, the encounter with God, there was not meant to be one moment in time. I mean, in one sense it was, but on the other hand, it was meant to be a continuous experience of the human and God, of Israel and God dwelling together. But, with protecting the sense of the sacred. The Ol Moed is the portable Sinai. It's a Sinai that continues. It's a place that allows God to dwell amongst you. And that is what they're trying to carry forward with them, Bamidbar Sinai, right? That's what the Sefer Bamidbar is about in the beginning. Taking Sinai with you as you march forward and march into the land. Okay. So that's one thing that he makes other points in this text. I'll let you look at it on your own, but I want to make sure we get to the Nitziv. And he says something very different. Not opposing, but just a different point. He says as follows. He says again, he notes that this is the Talit Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, he's centuries after Ramban, right? Ramban is what he's 13th century Spain, I think, something around there, and Nitziv is 19th century, Eastern Europe. So he says as follows: Zeh Sefer Nikra b'Fiatana Chumash HaPikudim. He says in the Gemara, right, that it's called in one place Chumash HaPikudim, right? The Chumash, one of the 5 books of the censuses or numbers. Okay, and so he says, "V'nirsham b'dat Rabbeinu in Yachni HaPikudim shevazeh Sefer." Because apparently the censuses in this book had a real impact upon the rabbis. Whoever decided to call this the book of numbers, the book of the censuses, they must have really been arrested by those censuses. They must have really caught their attention. Yoter mishar dvarim hashmuchadim b'zeh Sefer. Even more so, they didn't call it the book of the spies or the book of Bilam's, blessings and curses or whatever, right? They call it, by the way, the spies, this is Parsha Shlach, that wouldn't have been a bad name, right? Only because, the book of the spies, the instead of the spies is really a pivot in the book. Right? In the story of the spies, that's where we learn that the generation that left Egypt won't enter the land. It's only going to be their children who enter the land, and many years later. So that's really a major pivot in the book, maybe the major pivot in the book, and that wouldn't have been a bad name. So why do they call it Sefer Pikudim? So here's what he wants to say, and this is something else to really pay attention to. I underlined it here on the text. Bishum di'ikar zeh hasefer hu machlif hu mishaneh halichot am Hashem b'chayei ha'olam. Because what this book is really about, Mary said to ask you in the beginning to think if you're in an elevator, someone says to you, what's this book about? You have 30 seconds. So then Nitziv, if he was in the elevator with a Nitziv, he would have said the book is basically about the transition and transformation in the life of the people, right? How their sort of modus vivendi, how they live and experience life at large, right? On the path from Egypt until they get until the land of Israel, right? Min haderech Bamidbar. How so? So he says as follows. He says, well, there's 2 different experiences. There's desert living and there's the land living. Okay? In the desert, Bamidbar, over here, right, where my cursor is, right? Bamidbar, while living in the wilderness, there they have basically direct experience with God in their midst. Remember this whole passage we started with, right? With God, they're traveling, they have that divine ways, right? When the cloud is resting, they rest. The cloud's going, they're gone. They're all counted, they're all enumerated. Everything's clear and clean, and that also goes in sync with the way they live, right? They're eating off of divine bounty. They're fed manna from the heavens, right? They're taken care of entirely from God. They have this, they're living off of God's God's bounty. They're protected by God, right? That's a totally different type of life. He says, he calls this lama'ala mehalichot hateva. This is a supernatural type of living. Okay? It's a totally different type of life. It's not the life that you and I live. Ube'eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, that's what we call natural life. We would call that today that's our real. I think for most of us at least. I can't speak for you, but that's our real life experience. Eretz Yisrael halchu b'derech hateva. There they live in a world in which they're living in the natural world. He calls it derech hateva, where God's natural world, right, where God's providence is existent, but more disguised and hidden, as opposed to in the desert. And this change, this starts at the end of the time in the desert. It starts before they enter the land, right? Because the manna stops falling, right? And they start actually having to have these battles, right? To to enter the land. Okay, so the transition from a life of leaving Egypt with God and these plagues and the splitting of the sea and Sinai and a theophany and God in your midst, right, and the manna falling from heaven, that whole world, right, that whole world basically doesn't exist in the land. By the way, you could quibble with this because remember the story of Joshua and Jericho. That's not exactly how it goes. So this has to be nuanced a bit, but this is his general schema. Okay, and he says this transition is what the book is really about. It's about transitioning from model A until model B. Okay, in order to transition from model A to model B, the people have to transition. The people undergo a tremendous transition. When we said earlier, the book is about the people in a way. Actually, he cites this amazing midrash, which I brought to you below this source on your source sheets, from the midrash from Bereshit Rabbah. Says it's actually an amazing midrash. It takes, I'll scan it down for 1 second. It takes the verses in the beginning of Genesis, about, it's on page 10 to 11, or in the name of Rabbi Simon, right? That the light is mentioned 5 times in the beginning of the Torah. Each of those mentioning the word light corresponds to one of the books of the Pentateuch, one Chumash. Vayomer Elohim Yior, God said, let there be light. That correlates in some way to Sefer Bereshit at large, to the book of Bereshit. Okay? Vayior, that correlates to the book of Exodus. Okay, let there be light, that correlates to the book of Exodus when Israel goes from darkness to light. But look where I underline, and God separated, distinguished between the light and the dark. That is correlated with our book, the book of Bamidbar. Shehu Mavdil Bain Yotzei Mitzrayim Leva'ei Haaretz. That book distinguishes between those who left Egypt on the one hand, and on the other hand, those who will enter the land. Okay, so the book is about that transition, and it's about those 2 different generations. And indeed, the first half of the book, up until including chapter 10, right, what we've been focusing on thus far in our learning together. Okay, this world, which is, it's not a perfect world, but it is a sort of like idyllically realistic world, if you will, right? It's a world which knows the possibility of rupture, but imagines rupture as being containable and contained, right? Or portrays it that way. It's a world, in the Siv's, expression, it's a world of, direct divine hashgacha, providence, right? Direct encounter and guidance by God, right? The divine GPS, okay? Guiding them throughout. That's the land. That's the people who left Egypt, but they don't enter the land. And the story is about the transition between the former and the latter, between these 2 categories of people, and what happens. And really, what happens is from the middle part of the book, which we didn't discuss today much, but it's this week's parsha. That it's sort of like the height of the what happenness, which is the story of the spies. You have all manners of rupture. Right, you encounter a Bnei Israel and Israelites who are very, very human, and this is where you have, what you guys all talked about: the doubts, the leadership struggles is a big part of this, and we'll come to that, God willing. Right, the leadership struggles, the doubts, the tensions, the fighting, the infighting, the bickering, all of that. Right, the encounter with scarcity, the encounter with surplus, all of this stuff, which is very, very human, is very, very human. Happens in the middle of this book, and that's what marks the transition. And maybe just to articulate that, I think I will not get to the Haftorah right now, but just to articulate that, and then we'll start bringing it to a close. Let me just note one thing, okay? Before you get to all of that, disruption and such, in chapter 10 of the book of Numbers, from verse 29 to the end of the chapter, right, first you have Moses speaking to this Chovav, whoever Chovav is. It might be Yitro, his father-in-law, or otherwise, but speaking to this Chovav person, Chotain Moshe, it says, but and And he says, come with us to this really, really good land. That's good here all the time. Everything is good, good, good. Come to this really good land. And, we're going to go to this land. We're going from Sinai, by Yasume Har Hashem, right? It says they go from Har Hashem, they go 3 days, right? It sounds like they're like heading towards the land right away. They have the ark, leading the charge, Nosei Lefnehem, Lator Lehem Menucha, to seek out for them a resting place, Menucha. Well, that idea of Lator Lehem, right, to seek out for them, that's the same root that we find in Parshat Shalach, where Moses sends the spies Lator Ta'aretz. But there, it's not to seek out, to spy out, to do reconnaissance on the land. But there, it's not the Aron. It's not that which is sent Lator Ta'aretz. It is rather the spies, right? And that just what happens in between those two pictures are, one picture is the Aron of God is going to bring them right away into the land. We're right at the precipice. And then you have a whole other picture in the middle of the book where you have human beings being sent, and then the unfolding of the story of the spies and a different world. Okay. So in short, maybe I'll close here with a little comment from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, where he says as follows. Everyone can see that? Yeah. No, Willow, do you mind reading that? The book of Numbers?
Sure. The book of Numbers, in Hebrew, Bamidbar in the wilderness, is a key text for our time. It is among the most searching, self-critical books in all of literature, about what Nelson Mandela called the long walk to freedom. Its message is that there is no shortcut to liberty. Numbers is not an easy book to read, nor is it an optimistic one. It is a sober warning set in the middle of a text, the Hebrew Bible, that remains the West's master narrative of hope. The Mosaic books, especially Exodus and Numbers, are about the journey from slavery to freedom and from oppression to law-governed liberty. On the map, the distance from Egypt to the Promised Land is not far, but the message of Numbers is that it always takes longer than you think. For the journey is not just physical, a walk across the desert. It is psychological, moral, and spiritual. It takes as long as the time needed for human beings to change. That, as we discover in Numbers, can be a very long time indeed. Political change cannot be brought about by politics alone. It needs human transformation brought about by rituals, habits of the heart, and a strenuous process of education.
Okay. So with that, with those sort of framings of Rabbi Sachs, I think accords with the approach that we've been sort of developing here. We'll close today. But if anyone has anything they want to say, I'll stay on. Any questions or thoughts or ideas, and then we'll pick it up again next week. Next week, though, we'll focus a little bit less on the perfect, structure, or the realistically idyllic, realistic portrayal in the beginning of the book, and get into some of the nitty gritty and potential for rupture. Okay. Thanks, everybody. So like I said, I'll hang on here for a couple minutes if anyone would like, and otherwise I hope to see you next week.
Thank you. Thank you.